He leaned toward his men and whispered something in Arabic, low, cold, and cruel, his eyes cutting across the restaurant floor toward her like she was nothing more than furniture. He wished wasn't there. He didn't know she understood every word. He didn't know the woman he just insulted had grown up speaking that language before she ever learned to say please and thank you in English. He didn't know that in the next 30 seconds, she was going to make the most feared man in New York City feel something he hadn't felt in years: shame. If this story already has your heart pounding, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. Josephine Miller had a rule. She kept it simple, the way she kept most things in her life: clean, efficient, and quiet. The rule was this: never let them see you react. Not when the man in the $3,000 suit looked her up and down like she was something he'd accidentally stepped on. Not when the woman at table 7 clicked her fingers instead of saying her name. Not when the hostess, who was barely 23 and had never once carried a tray heavier than her own ego, whispered something to a coworker behind her hand, and they both smiled that particular kind of smile that wasn't really a smile at all. Never let them see you react. Josephine had been working at Maison Éclat for 6 years. 6 years of marble floors and crystal chandeliers, 6 years of $14 sparkling water, and $70 appetizers that arrived in portions small enough to make you wonder if the chef was making a philosophical statement. The restaurant sat on the 40th floor of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan, and from the dining room, if you angled yourself just right between the tables, you could see the whole city spread out below like something you'd once dreamed and never quite reached. It was by every measurable standard a beautiful place, and Josephine moved through it like a ghost, efficient, invisible, and utterly unremarkable to the people who mattered. That was intentional. She had learned early that there were two kinds of invisible. There was the kind that happened to you when people looked through you because they'd already decided you weren't worth seeing. And then there was the kind you chose when you made yourself small and quiet and unnoticeable because it was safer, because it was smarter, because it meant you could do your job without becoming the subject of someone else's entertainment. Josephine had mastered the second kind. At 34, she was tall, brown-skinned, and what the women's magazines her mother used to read would have called full-figured, which was their way of saying she took up space in a world that had never quite made room for her. She'd heard every variation of what that meant growing up. She'd heard it in hallways and locker rooms, in the back of school buses, and across dinner tables from relatives who thought concern and cruelty were the same thing. She'd carried it the way you carry something heavy for so long that eventually your body just adjusts. The weight becomes part of your posture, part of the way you breathe, part of the voice in your head that runs like background noise you've stopped noticing. But here at Maison Éclat, she didn't have to think about any of that. Here, she was the best server on the floor, and everyone knew it. "Joe!" It was Marcus, the floor manager, falling into step beside her as she moved toward the kitchen with a tray of empty glasses. He was a small, tightly wound man with reading glasses he constantly forgot he was wearing, and a talent for making everything sound like either a crisis or a secret. Tonight his voice was doing both. "I need you focused," he said without preamble. "Full capacity tonight. Senator Morrison's at 12, the Caldwell party just confirmed for 6 at 9, and I've got a reservation that came in 2 hours ago that I need you to understand was not a request." He paused, the way people paused when they wanted you to ask the question, so she didn't ask it. She just looked at him. He lowered his voice. "Taylor Rossi." The name landed in the air between them and just stayed there. Josephine had never met Taylor Rossi. She didn't need to. You didn't need to meet a storm to know you didn't want to be standing in an open field when it arrived. You didn't need to know a man personally to understand that when his name came up in certain rooms, people changed the way they were holding their bodies. She'd heard the name the way you hear names like that, not in news reports or police briefings, but in the sideways way that Manhattan operated, in the gaps between conversations at restaurants like this one, in the way certain clients never quite finished their sentences when they mentioned him. "Rossi," she repeated. "He's bringing 6 men with him. He's taken the private alcove, the full setup, the Krug champagne, the Wagyu, everything." Marcus was walking faster now, and she adjusted her pace to match. "Joe, I need the table handled perfectly. No mistakes, no hesitation, no—" "Marcus." "What? When have I ever given you a mistake?" He stopped walking. He looked at her. And then because he was Marcus, and Marcus was constitutionally incapable of admitting anything directly, he adjusted his glasses and said, "Just be careful." She didn't ask him what that meant. She already knew. The private alcove at Maison Éclat was separated from the main floor by a half wall of frosted glass and a curtain of thin metal beading that caught the light in a way the interior designer had probably spent 3 weeks deciding on. It was in theory a space for privacy. In practice, it was a space for the kind of conversations that didn't happen at regular tables, deals, negotiations, celebrations that weren't meant to be witnessed. Josephine had worked that alcove more times than she could count. She knew it the way she knew her own apartment, the angle of the lighting, which chair had the loose leg, exactly how far the curtain needed to be pulled back to allow easy service without feeling intrusive. She restocked the setup herself that night, the crystal glasses, the ice bucket, the small leather menu she knew nobody in that party was going to look at, because men like Taylor Rossi didn't need to consult menus to know what they wanted. She was finishing the final arrangement when she heard them arrive. She didn't see it happen. She was facing the far wall, making a minor adjustment to the placement of the champagne glasses, when the energy in the restaurant changed. She felt it before she processed it, a kind of atmospheric shift, the way a room feels different before a thunderstorm, when the pressure drops and the air gets heavier and everything goes slightly, inexplicably still. She turned around slowly. Taylor Rossi was standing at the entrance to the main floor. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe late 30s, perhaps 40, at the very edge with dark hair cut short, and a face that would have been almost classically handsome if it hadn't been for the absolute stillness of his expression, the absence of any readable warmth or social performance. Most powerful men in Josephine's experience wore their power outwardly. They smiled big, they spoke loudly. They filled spaces with sound and motion and the constant implicit announcement of their own importance. This man did none of those things. He simply existed in the room, and the room rearranged itself around him. He moved through the dining area without looking at anyone directly, not dismissive, not arrogant, just utterly self-contained, like a man who had long ago stopped needing the confirmation of other people's attention. His 6 men fell into position around him with the practiced, natural ease of people who'd done this so many times it had become instinct, not performance. They didn't scan the room aggressively or make a show of their alertness. They just moved, and the effect was quiet and total, and somehow more intimidating than anything louder would have been. Josephine exhaled. She picked up the champagne list and stepped forward. She didn't think about how she looked. She'd made her peace with that years ago, or at least she'd built a working relationship with the subject, which was not the same thing as peace, but was a functional substitute. She thought about the table, the order, the sequence of service. She thought about Marcus's voice saying, "Be careful." She thought about her brother Liam, who had texted her 3 times that day with variations of, "Don't worry about it," which in Liam's language was the universal signal for things are currently very bad, and I would like you to not find out. She stepped through the beaded curtain. "Good evening," she said. Her voice came out exactly as she intended, warm without being eager, professional without being cold. "My name is Josephine, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you gentlemen with something to drink while you settle in?" Taylor Rossi was already seated at the head of the table. He looked up at her. And then he looked at her, the second kind of looking, the kind that was really an assessment, a quick and practiced inventory of what she was and what category to file her under, and she knew from long experience what conclusion men like him usually reached when they ran that particular calculation. He said nothing. One of his men, broad-shouldered, with a thick accent she couldn't immediately place, said, "Bring the Krug and water, still." "Of course." She moved to the ice bucket, lifted the champagne with the cloth she'd kept folded over her forearm, and began to pour with the careful, practiced expertise of someone who understood that this was not just pouring a drink, but a performance. A small, daily proof that she was good at something that couldn't be taken from her. She was 3 glasses in when it happened. She didn't even register it as her fault. The man 2 seats from Rossi shifted suddenly, his elbow catching the arm she'd extended, and the glass tipped. It wasn't a flood. It wasn't catastrophic. A controlled splash of champagne across the tablecloth, a small contained accident of the kind that happened in restaurants every single night. But it happened near Taylor Rossi, and the look on his face changed. Not dramatically. Not the way faces change in movies with visible fury and clenched jaws and flared nostrils. It was subtler than that, and somehow more pointed, a narrowing of the eyes, a slight tightening around the mouth, the look of a man who found something not just inconvenient, but personally offensive. "I'm so sorry," Josephine said immediately and professionally, reaching for the cloth. "Let me take care of that." And that was when he turned to his men. He turned away from her as if she had ceased to exist, as if she were not a person standing 2 feet away with a cloth in her hand, and he began to speak, in Arabic, fluid, casual, and completely dismissive. She kept her face absolutely neutral. He was saying, and she was translating in real time, each word arriving with crystalline precision in the part of her mind that had learned this language not from a classroom, but from years of living inside it, from childhood afternoons in a dusty apartment in Dubai, where her father worked oil contracts and her mother taught English, and Josephine ran wild through neighborhoods where Arabic was the air itself. He was saying something that turned her blood cold. He was not talking about the spill, he was talking about her. Did you see the size of her? His Arabic was Levantine, slightly Beiruti, the accent of an educated man from money. He leaned back in his chair with the casual ease of someone who had never once considered the possibility of consequences. "God, no wonder she can't hold a glass. I don't know how she even got hired. Is this some kind of—" He used a word she won't repeat, not here, not ever, charity program, hire the ones nobody else wants. One of his men laughed brief and low. Another said something she didn't quite catch, and Rossi continued quieter now, almost bored. She should have stayed in the kitchen. At least there maybe she'd be useful. Here she's just a liability, a big slow liability who can't even pour wine without disaster. Josephine's hand had stilled on the cloth. She was no longer cleaning the spill. She was standing very quietly, with the cloth gripped between her fingers, and every word landing in her chest, like something cold and deliberate, and she was thinking about every version of this moment she had ever lived before. Every hallway, every dinner table, every sideways smile, and she was thinking about her rule. Never let them see you react. She had kept that rule for 34 years. She had kept it in school and in break rooms and at family dinners and at this very restaurant, at this very kind of table, in front of this very kind of man. She had kept it and kept it and kept it until keeping it had started to feel less like wisdom and more like a slow erasure, like the difference between choosing silence and disappearing. And she had lived with that distinction by telling herself it didn't matter, that the only thing that mattered was getting through the day with her dignity intact, that her dignity lived in her restraint and not in her voice. But as she stood there listening to Taylor Rossi describe her in Arabic with the flat absolute certainty of a man who had never once been wrong about anyone because he'd never once had to be, something in Josephine Miller came very quietly undone, not loudly, not explosively, not the way it happens in movies where the music swells and the protagonist throws the tray and everyone claps, quietly. Like a rope that had been fraying for years and had finally at last, at this precise moment, at this precise table, found its final thread. She set the cloth down on the edge of the table. She straightened her posture. She looked directly at Taylor Rossi, who was still turned slightly away from her, still speaking to his men, still completely assured that the woman 2 feet away was nothing but background noise, and she opened her mouth, and she spoke to him in Arabic, not broken, not accented, not halting or uncertain, or the Arabic of a woman who'd taken a few classes and memorized some phrases. She spoke with the fluency of someone who had grown up inside the language, who had thought in it and dreamed in it and fought and cried and laughed in it, and when the words came out, they came out with a precision and a weight that made every man at the table go absolutely still. She said, "A man who says what he really thinks only in languages he believes his target cannot understand, that man is not powerful. That man is a coward." The silence that followed was total. Not a glass moved, not a chair shifted. Taylor Rossi turned to look at her, and for the first time since he'd entered the restaurant, Josephine saw something she had not expected to see on the face of a man like him. Surprise. Pure, unfiltered, genuine surprise. The kind you can't perform and can't conceal. The kind that lives in the fraction of a second before the mask comes back up. She held his gaze, did not look away, did not soften, did not apologize. For exactly 3 seconds, Josephine Miller and Taylor Rossi looked at each other across a table in a restaurant 40 floors above Manhattan, and the entire world of Maison Éclat held its breath. Then one of his men moved a hand reaching toward his jacket, and Taylor. Rossi said quietly, and without looking away from Josephine, "Don't." The hand stopped. He was still watching her. His expression had shifted into something she couldn't quite name. Not anger, not amusement, not the cold contempt she'd braced herself for, but something else. Something that felt unsettlingly like attention. Real attention. The kind he probably didn't give most people, and definitely didn't give waitresses. "Sit down," he said. It took Josephine a moment to understand he was talking to her. "I'm working," she said. "I'm aware." His Arabic was slower now, more deliberate. "Sit down." "Mr. Rossi," she said, switching to English, not because she was retreating, but because she wanted every syllable to land without any buffer of translation, "I have other tables." "You had other tables," he said in English now, as well smooth and accented, and completely calm. "Now you have this one." She stared at him. He stared back, and Marcus appeared at the edge of the curtain, his face a portrait of controlled professional terror, his eyes making frantic small gestures at Josephine that she interpreted without difficulty, as "Whatever you're doing, please stop doing it immediately for the love of everything." She looked at Marcus. She looked at Taylor Rossi. She looked at the 6 men around the table, all watching her with varying degrees of caution and fascination. She pulled out the nearest empty chair. She sat down. Taylor Rossi leaned forward slightly, rested one forearm on the table, and looked at her with an expression she would think about for a long time afterward, not because it was threatening, but because it wasn't, and that somehow was more disturbing than anything else. "Where did you learn Arabic?" he said. "Dubai," she said. "My father worked there for 12 years. I grew up there." "How long?" "From when I was 4 until I was 16. He nodded slowly. "And the dialect, Beiruti influence in your pronunciation. Your teacher was Lebanese." "My neighbor, she was from Tripoli, actually." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, almost nothing, the ghost of a response. "What's your name?" he said. "Josephine." "Josephine." He said it the way people say names when they're deciding whether they're going to remember them. "And how long have you worked here?" 6 years. 6 years. He glanced around the alcove, something almost evaluative in the look, then back to her. "You're wasted here." She blinked. "Excuse me." "I said you're wasted here." His voice was entirely matter-of-fact, the way someone states an obvious logistical problem. "A woman who speaks Arabic at that level working as a waitress in a Manhattan restaurant." He paused. "That's either a tragedy or a choice." "It's a job," she said flatly. "Everything is a job," he said. "The question is whether it's the right one." She felt something stir in her chest, something she immediately firmly pushed back down, because she was not going to be disarmed by a man who had just described her as a liability in a language he thought she couldn't understand, and she was certainly not going to let the disarming happen while she was sitting at his table, because he'd told her to, which was also something she was going to think about later. "Mr. Rossi," she said carefully, "I believe what I'm owed is an apology." The word landed. His expression didn't change, but something in the air between them did a slight recalibration, a shift in pressure. One of his men made a sound. Not a word, just a sound, the kind of sound men make in groups when one of their number is being spoken to in an unexpected way by someone they hadn't budgeted for in their mental accounting of the evening. Taylor Rossi looked at that man, then back at her. "You're right," he said. She hadn't expected that. She kept her face still. "What I said was—" He paused, and she had the strange sense he was choosing his words not from social obligation, but from some internal standard she didn't yet understand, unacceptable and incorrect. Another pause. "I was wrong about you." "You were," she agreed. "I'm not often wrong, I'm sure." "It bothers me," he said. Not performing discomfort, just stating it. "Good," she said. For the second time that evening, something moved at the corner of his mouth. This time it lasted a fraction of a second longer. He leaned back. He picked up his champagne glass. Someone had quietly refilled it while this entire conversation was happening, because the staff at Maison Éclat were professionals, even when everything was falling apart, and he looked at her over the rim. "Josephine," he said, "I have a proposition." She looked at him steadily. "I'm listening." "I need a translator. Arabic, specifically Levantine dialect with Khaliji fluency. I have a meeting in 72 hours with people who will speak in language codes specifically to exclude me from certain conversations." He set the glass down. "I need someone who can follow the conversation underneath the conversation." "I'm a waitress," she said. "You're a linguist who's been wasting her talents," he said. "And you're currently the only person in Manhattan I've met in the last 6 months who interests me enough to make this offer. What kind of meeting?" "A small shift." "Business." "What kind of business?" The shift again, slower, more deliberate, his eyes on hers measuring something. "The kind," he said quietly, "that doesn't get discussed in public restaurants." The full weight of what he was settled over her. Then not a story, not a rumor, but the actual man, the actual gravity of him, the way the space around him operated on different rules than the rest of the room. She thought about Marcus's voice saying, "Be careful." She thought about Liam's texts. She thought about her rule. She thought about the Arabic words she'd said and how saying them had felt like the first full breath she'd taken in years, and how terrifying it was to want to keep breathing. "I have to get back to work," she said. "Of course." He didn't move to stop her. "But you'll think about it." It wasn't a question. She stood. She straightened her uniform jacket with the small, precise movement she'd perfected over 6 years of this job. She picked up the cloth she'd set on the table's edge. "The champagne is Krug Grande Cuvée," she said. "The Wagyu is best ordered medium rare tonight. The chef is using a slightly higher fat content cut, and the texture holds better. And your second bottle should be chilled for another 4 minutes. She looked at him directly. "I'll be back to check in 10. She stepped through the curtain and back onto the main floor of Maison Éclat, where the rest of the restaurant had been continuing its evening the way restaurants do, with wine and silverware and the low hum of conversation, completely unaware that something had just shifted in the alcove by the frosted glass. Something that, though none of them could have known, it was not finished shifting. Not by a long way. She walked back onto the main floor, and her legs were steady, and her face was composed, and her hands, the hands that had gripped that cloth, like it was the only solid thing left in the world, were completely still. That was the thing about Josephine Miller. She could fall apart on the inside, and nobody would ever know. She checked table 12, refilled Senator Morrison's water without being asked, smiled at the woman across from him, who was clearly not his wife, and made a mental note about the Waldorf salad that needed to be cleared. She did all of this on autopilot, because the other half of her brain was still sitting in that alcove, still hearing Taylor Rossi's voice, saying "you're wasted here," with the same casual certainty he probably used to decide everything: what to eat, who to trust, who to destroy. She didn't want to think about him. She thought about him anyway. Marcus intercepted her near the service station. His voice dropped so low she had to tilt her head to catch it. "What happened in there? Rossi's man came to find me, said there was an incident. Joe, tell me right now that you didn't—" "Everything is fine," she said. "That is not a specific answer." "Everything is fine, Marcus." She picked up a tray. "The table is being handled." He stared at her the way he always stared at her when he suspected she was telling him the truth, but not the whole truth, which was often. "His guy said you sat down at the table." "Briefly." "You sat down at Taylor Rossi's table." He pressed 2 fingers to his temple. "During your shift." "Marcus," she looked at him calmly, "has his table complained?" He paused. "No." "Is the service continuing?" Another pause. "Yes." "Then I suggest we both get back to work." She was halfway to the kitchen before he called after her, quiet and urgent. "Joe, be careful." She kept walking. It was just past 9 when her phone buzzed in her apron pocket twice quick, which was Liam's signal for "I need to talk, but I'm trying not to seem desperate," which meant he was desperate. She ignored it through the salad course and the entree service. She ignored it through a second champagne order from table 9 and a birthday dessert presentation that required her to carry a lit sparkler across the main floor while maintaining what Marcus called her composed professional smile, which was different from a real smile in ways that would take too long to explain. She stepped into the staff corridor at 9:47 and called her brother back. He picked up on the first ring. "Hey," he said, and she heard it immediately, that particular quality in his voice, the one that had been showing up more and more over the past few months, that mix of forced lightness and barely contained anxiety, like a man trying to sound fine while standing on ice that is actively cracking beneath him. "How bad?" she said. No preamble. A beat of silence. "I'm handling it." "Liam? Joe? How bad?" She heard him exhale, long and slow, the sound of someone releasing a breath they'd been holding for days. 43,000, he said, give or take. The corridor walls didn't move, but they felt like they did. 43. She stopped, started again. Who? It doesn't matter who. It absolutely matters who. Joe, I said I'm handling. You called me at 9:47 on a Friday night during my shift, she said, keeping her voice low and level because the kitchen door was 15 feet away and she was a professional even when everything was collapsing. That means you're not handling it. That means you've already not been handling it for long enough that the situation has gotten to a place where you feel like you have to tell me. So I need to know who. Another silence, longer this time. Caruso, he said finally. She closed her eyes. Caruso. Angelo Caruso, who ran a collection operation out of a sports bar in Bensonhurst and whose patience for unpaid debts was by neighborhood reputation roughly equivalent to his patience for everything else, which was to say none whatsoever. When's the deadline? She asked. 2 weeks, maybe 10 days the way things are, Joe. I swear to you. I thought I had this. I thought the sports line was going to... Liam. She said it quietly, but the way she said it stopped him the way a closed door stops you. I don't need the explanation right now. I need to know what happens in 10 days if the money isn't there. The silence this time had a different quality. He'll send people, Liam said. Okay, she said. Okay, Joe. Did you hear? I heard you. I need to go back to work. She took a breath that she didn't let him hear. Don't go anywhere tonight. Stay at your apartment. Don't talk to Caruso or anyone connected to Caruso. I'll call you tomorrow. Joe, stay home, Liam. She ended the call. She stood in the corridor for 11 seconds. She counted them. 11 seconds in which she allowed herself to feel the full weight of $43,000 in 10 days, and her brother's voice, and the sound of ice cracking, and then she put all of it in the place she kept things that couldn't be dealt with right this minute, and she smoothed her jacket and she picked up her tray, and she walked back onto the main floor. The alcove curtain was partially open. One of Rossi's men, the broad-shouldered one who'd ordered the water, was standing just outside it, and he straightened when he saw her and said, Mr. Rossi would like another bottle. I'll bring it right out, she said. She was back at the alcove 3 minutes later with the champagne. The table had settled into a different register, the meal winding down, the men more relaxed in their chairs, the particular ease of people who have been in each other's company long enough that the performance of the evening has softened into something more familiar. 2 of the men were in a low conversation she could tell from their body language was about logistics, not pleasure. Another was on his phone. Taylor Rossi was watching her open the bottle. Not the bottle. Her. She focused on the pour, controlled, clean professional. You never answered, he said. I wasn't aware I was supposed to, she said. The proposition. You said it was business. She set the bottle back in the ice. You didn't give me enough information to answer. What information do you need? She looked at him. The kind you don't share in public restaurants. Something shifted in his expression. The closest thing to approval she had yet seen on a face that seemed constitutionally resistant to giving approval. You're quick. I've been called worse. She picked up the cloth. How long is the engagement? 3 days. You'd be present for initial meetings, a main negotiation session, and a closing dinner, all in the city. And the people I'd be translating for, who are they? Associates from Beirut and Cairo. The Beirut group speaks primarily Arabic among themselves. The Cairo contact will switch between Arabic and French depending on whether he wants to be understood. He paused. It's important that I know what's being said when they believe I don't. You don't speak Arabic at all. A few words. He almost smiled. Not enough. She thought about Liam. About $43,000. About 10 days. She thought about her rule. "What's the compensation?" she said. He named a number. She kept her face still. The number was not small. The number was in fact precisely the kind of number that could resolve a particular problem that currently had a 10-day deadline attached to it with enough left over to mean something. "For 3 days," she said. "For 3 days," he confirmed. She stood there with the cloth in her hand and the champagne open and 6 men watching her and the weight of her brother's voice still sitting in her chest, and she made the calculation the way she made all her calculations, quickly, quietly, without letting anyone see it happening. "I need more information before I can agree to anything," she said. "That's reasonable. And I have conditions. I expected you would. You don't know anything about me." "I know you speak Arabic better than most of my contacts who were born speaking it," he said. "I know you've been working this restaurant for 6 years, and you're still on the floor, which means either you like it here or you have reasons to need the stability. I know that when you said the word coward to me tonight, your voice didn't shake once." He paused. "I know enough. The thing about being told you've been seen by someone who doesn't see most people is that it does something to the walls you've spent years building. Not immediately, not dramatically, just a hairline crack in exactly the wrong place." She picked up the empty glasses. "I'll need to think about it," she said. "You have until midnight." She looked at him. "That's 3 hours." "It's enough time." She stepped back through the curtain. She made it all the way to the service station before her hands started trembling, the small, invisible tremor she'd been holding back since the alcove, since the corridor, since Liam's voice saying 43,000, with the tone of a man confessing something he'd buried so long, it had started to affect the soil around it. "Joe?" It was Priya, the other senior server, sliding in beside her with the particular efficiency of someone who had been watching the whole evening from a careful distance. "What is happening? I need to know what is happening right now." "Service," Josephine said. "The same thing that's always happening." "You sat at Taylor Rossi's table." "Briefly." "Joe, Taylor Rossi." "Priya." "I Googled him in the bathroom," Priya said in a fast whisper. "Joe, that man is, I mean the things that come up when you search his name are not. There are congressional hearings." "Priya," Josephine looked at her friend directly. "I need you to take Table 9's dessert order. Can you do that?" Priya stared at her. "You're not even a little scared." "I'm terrified," Josephine said simply. "I'm just also working." She made it through the next 2 hours with the sustained, controlled focus of a woman who had learned that feelings and function do not have to be scheduled at the same time. Table 9 got their dessert. Table 12 got their check. Senator Morrison's guest, definitely not his wife, left 15 minutes before the senator himself and Josephine noted the logistics of this without comment because it was not her evening to have. At 11:20, she was back at the alcove. The party was preparing to leave. She could tell from the arrangement of jackets and phones and the way the conversation had the particular quality of wrap-up, the things said between people who are about to separate and want to land on a note that carries the right weight. Taylor Rossi was standing. He was taller than she'd fully registered when he was seated, not aggressively tall, but the kind of tall that added to the overall architecture of him, the sense that every physical detail had been arranged for maximum impact without any apparent intention of being obvious about it. He looked at her. 11:20, she said. "I'm aware. You gave me until midnight. I know what I said." She smoothed her jacket. She had spent the last 2 hours weighing it from every angle she could reach the risk. The money, the thing about Liam, the thing about Rossi, the things Priya had found in her bathroom. Google session, the expression on his face when he said "you're wasted here," the way he'd told his man "don't," and the hand had stopped. She had weighed it all. "I'll do it," she said. Something moved across his face, fast, controlled, but there. "Good." "My conditions," she said. "Name them." "I don't carry anything. I don't sign anything. I don't know anything I'm not directly told. I translate what I hear. That's the entirety of my role." She looked at him steadily. "And I need half the payment in advance. Tomorrow." A pause. His men had gone quiet again. "Half in advance is unusual." So is hiring a waitress for a Mafia negotiation, she said. The word landed in the air between them. Mafia, and she watched his face for the flinch, the denial, the careful redirection that powerful men usually deployed when the actual word was used in proximity to them. He didn't flinch. He looked at her for a long moment with that same unsettling quality of attention, the kind that made her feel simultaneously like an asset being evaluated and a person being genuinely considered, and she didn't know which of those things was more dangerous. "Half in advance," he said. "Agreed." She nodded once. He reached into his jacket and produced a card, plain white, no logo, just a number printed in small black type. He held it out to her. She took it. Their fingers didn't touch. She was careful about that. She didn't know why she was careful about that. She was careful about it anyway. 9 a.m., he said. "Call that number. My assistant will give you the details." "Understood." She pocketed the card. He looked at her one more moment. Then he turned and moved toward the exit, with his men falling into position around him, and within 30 seconds, it was as if the weather had changed. The pressure, lifting the atmosphere of the restaurant, snapping back to its regular frequency, the low hum of other people's conversations rushing in to fill the space he'd occupied. Josephine stood at the edge of the alcove with a card in her apron pocket and $43,000 behind her eyes, and 3 days of something she didn't have a clean word for directly ahead of her. Priya appeared at her shoulder like a woman who had been watching from precisely the right angle. "Well, we should clear the alcove," Josephine said. "Service is almost done." "Josephine Adeyeze Miller. Start with the glasses." "Did he ask you to do something?" Josephine looked at her friend. Priya, who had worked beside her for 4 years, who knew about Liam and the gambling and the creeping dread of the past few months, who had once driven Josephine to urgent care at 2 a.m. and sat in the waiting room for 3 hours reading old magazines without being asked and without complaining, who was currently looking at her with an expression that was equal parts worry and the specific alertness of someone who already knows the answer to the question they're asking. "Don't look at me like that," Josephine said. "I'm looking at you like someone who loves you and needs to know if you're about to do something I'm going to spend the next 6 months worried about." Josephine started collecting the glasses. "Go home, Priya," she said quietly. "I'll finish the clothes." "Joe, I'm fine." She looked up. "I'll call you tomorrow." Priya didn't leave immediately. She stood there for another few seconds in the way of someone deciding whether to push, and then she made the decision that people who truly know you sometimes make the decision to trust that you know what you're doing even when everything in them wants to ask one more time. She squeezed Josephine's arm. Brief, firm the language of "I'm here" without requiring a response. Then she left. Josephine finished the clothes alone. She stacked the glasses and folded the linens and returned the ice bucket to the station and did every small, orderly thing that ended a service shift. And when she was done, she stood in the empty alcove for exactly 1 moment with her hand in her apron pocket, her fingers touching the edge of a plain white card with a number printed in small black type. She thought about her rule. Never let them see you react. She had broken it tonight at this very table in front of the most dangerous man who had ever sat in it. And the world had not ended. She took her hand out of her pocket. She turned off the alcove light. She walked out. She called the number at 9:02 the next morning. She had not slept well. Not badly, exactly. She hadn't lain awake catastrophizing the way she sometimes did, the way her brain liked to run its worst-case simulations at 3 a.m. when there was nothing useful she could do about any of them. It was more that sleep had come in shallow intervals, interrupted by the particular kind of alertness that arrives when your body knows something significant is happening, even if your mind hasn't fully processed what that something is. She'd made coffee. She'd sat at her kitchen table with her phone on the surface in front of her and the plain white card beside it, and she'd looked at the number for a long time without picking up the phone. Not from hesitation, the decision was made. She didn't unmake decisions, but from the habit she had of understanding exactly what she was doing before she did it. She was calling a number on a card given to her by a man whose full name appeared in congressional hearing transcripts. She was doing this because her brother owed $43,000 to a man named Caruso, who sent people when debts went unpaid. She was doing this because last night she had spoken Arabic to a Mafia boss in a restaurant 40 floors above Manhattan, and somewhere in the wreckage of that moment, a door had opened that she didn't entirely want to walk through, but understood she was going to walk through anyway. She picked up the phone at 9:02. A woman answered on the second ring, crisp, efficient, completely unsurprised. "Ms. Miller, Mr. Razi asked me to expect your call. Can you be at the Meridian offices on 53rd by 11? "Yes," Josephine said. "Bring identification. You'll be meeting with Mr. Razi's legal team first. Standard for any engagement of this nature." "Legal team," she repeated. "Confidentiality agreement, scope of work, compensation terms. It should take about 40 minutes. A brief pause. "The first payment will be transferred upon signing." She had not fully expected the formality of it. She had assembled somewhere in the back of her mind a vague expectation of something more covert, a parking garage maybe, or a conversation through a half-open car window, which was what happened in every crime film she had ever seen, and was almost certainly not how actual criminal enterprises handled their paperwork. But there was something almost more unsettling about the legitimacy of it. The Meridian offices, a legal team, confidentiality agreements. It meant he had done this before. It meant there was an entire apparatus built around the kind of thing she was about to walk into. "I'll be there at 11, she said. She called Liam after she hung up. He answered, sounding like someone who had also not slept well, but had spent his sleeplessness on the less productive end of the spectrum. She could hear it in the particular texture of his voice, the slight drag, the effort it took him to sound normal. "I need you to do something for me," she said. "Joe, don't say my name in that tone, just listen." She took a breath. "I'm handling the Caruso situation." A long silence. "What does that mean?" "It means I have a way to get the money. It means you have to trust me and not ask questions and not do anything, not contact Caruso, not try to negotiate more time, not take out any additional debt, trying to buy yourself a few extra days. Just stay still. Can you do that?" "Joe, how are you getting $43,000? "I took a job." "What job?" "You have a job?" "A second job. Translation work." She kept her voice clean and even. "It pays well." Another silence. She could hear him breathing, which meant he was thinking, which meant he was doing the math and not quite arriving at a number that made comfortable sense. "Translation work that pays $43,000, he said slowly. "It's specialized work," she said. "Joe." "Liam." She said it the way she always said it when she needed him to stop, not hard, not unkind, but final. "I need you to let me handle this. I need you to trust me the way I have spent the last 6 years trusting you every single time you told me you had something under control." The silence after that had a different quality, the kind that comes from a man being handed the truth about himself in a way that's too precise to deflect. "Okay," he said quietly. "Stay home today." "Okay. I'll call you tonight." She ended the call, put the phone in her bag, and got ready. The Meridian offices were on the 31st floor of a building that looked from the outside like any of the dozen other corporate towers in the block glass steel, the kind of anonymous authority that Manhattan buildings wore like a uniform. The lobby had a security desk staffed by a man who checked her ID with practiced efficiency and gave her a visitor badge without making eye contact, which she appreciated. The legal team turned out to be one woman, mid-50s, silver-haired, wearing reading glasses on a chain, and an expression that suggested she had seen everything and been surprised by nothing for at least the past decade. Her name was Elaine. She shook Josephine's hand with a firm, brief grip and gestured to the chair across from her desk. "The agreement is straightforward," Elaine said, sliding a document across the desk. "You're engaged as a language consultant for a series of business meetings over the course of 3 days. Dates here, compensation structure here and here." She indicated a paragraph, the confidentiality provisions. "In summary, nothing you hear in the context of this engagement leaves the engagement. Not to family, not to friends, not to any third party, not to law enforcement, absent a direct subpoena, at which point we would be notified immediately." Josephine read the document carefully. Elaine waited without rushing her. It was as promised straightforward. The language was precise and clearly drafted by someone who understood exactly what it needed to accomplish without providing anything extraneous. She looked for the things that weren't there: clauses about exclusivity, about future engagement, about anything that extended her obligation beyond the stated 3 days, and found none. She signed. Elaine countersigned, slid a copy across, and said, "The first payment will reflect in your account within the hour. Mr. Rossi would like a brief meeting before the first session tomorrow. He'll be in touch this afternoon with a time." "Thank you," Josephine said. "Ms. Miller." Elaine's voice shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough. "I've handled Mr. Rossi's consulting arrangements for 11 years. She paused. "Most consultants come through referrals, established channels. You're the first one he's sourced himself." Another pause, shorter. "I mention this only because it's unusual. And in Mr. Rossi's world, unusual things tend to develop in unexpected directions." Josephine looked at her. "Is that advice?" Elaine's expression didn't change. "It's an observation." "Noted," Josephine said. She stood, picked up her copy, and left. The money appeared in her account at 10:47. She was in the elevator when her phone buzzed with the notification, and she looked at the number and felt something complicated move through her, not guilt exactly and not relief exactly, but some combination of the two that sat uncomfortably in the space between them. She called Liam's phone. "The money will be in your account by end of day," she said when he picked up. "Pay Caruso, all of it. Don't negotiate, don't ask for more time, don't have any conversation with him that isn't you handing over the full amount." A beat of silence. "Joe, how—" "End of day," she said. "I mean it about the conversation, Liam. Just pay it." "Okay." His voice was very quiet. "Thank you." She didn't say, "You're welcome," because she didn't feel welcome yet, didn't feel the clean, uncomplicated gratitude that should have come with solving the problem, because the problem wasn't solved, it was traded. Traded for 3 days of something she still didn't have the full shape of, for a plain white card, and a signed agreement, and an observation from a silver-haired lawyer who had been doing this for 11 years. She went home. She changed out of the clothes she'd worn to the meeting and made a second cup of coffee and sat with it at her kitchen table, with the copy of the agreement in front of her, rereading the scope section, mapping the dimensions of what she'd agreed to. 3 days. Translation: the Beirut group and the Cairo contact. She had enough context now from the meeting, from Elaine's manner, from 11 years of Elaine, to understand the territory she was entering, even if she couldn't see the specific landscape yet. She thought about what it meant to hear what was being said under what was being said. Languages had always worked that way for her. Arabic especially. It was not a language that operated on the surface, not the way English could not, with the same preference for directness and stated meaning. Arabic moved in layers. It curved around things. It said one thing and meant 3, and which of the 3 you caught depended on how well you understood not just the words, but the space the words were making. She was good at the space. She had always been good at the space. Her phone rang at 2 in the afternoon. Unknown number, but she'd been expecting it. "Ms. Miller." His voice was different on the phone. Not warmer exactly, but less formal, the professional distance that came with a physical setting removed. "I trust the meeting with Elaine went smoothly." "It did. I have an hour this evening if you're available. I'd like to give you context before tomorrow." "What time?" 6. There's a place on 47th Caldera. The back dining room is quiet." She had a brief, sharp awareness of the geometry of this restaurant again, because apparently that was the territory where she and Taylor Rossi existed, the precise overlap of their worlds, given the randomness of last night. Or maybe it wasn't random. Maybe this was how he operated, always in controlled public spaces, always with an exit, always somewhere that looked like civilization. 6, she said. "I'll be there." She arrived first, which was intentional. The back dining room at Caldera was small, 6 tables good, lighting the kind of ambient noise level that provided privacy without effort. She'd chosen a seat with sightlines to both the door and the service entrance, which was a habit she'd developed somewhere in the last 24 hours without fully deciding to. She ordered water and sat with it and waited. He arrived at 6:03 with one man, just one, which struck her as significant, though she couldn't have explained precisely why. The man took a position near the entrance, and Rossi came to the table and sat across from her, without ceremony, without the theater of someone who needed to be seen making an entrance. "You read the full agreement," he said, not a question. "Twice," she said. "Something like approval." "Good." He picked up the water menu, set it down immediately. "The group coming in from Beirut represents an import operation textiles officially. They're expanding into East Coast distribution, and they want a North American partner. The meeting tomorrow is an initial discussion of terms." "And the Cairo contact?" "Tariq Mansour. He represents a third party with interests in both the Beirut group and mine. He's a facilitator. He's also someone who will absolutely have private conversations in Arabic that he believes I cannot follow, and those conversations are the ones that matter to me." "You think he's playing both sides?" A pause. "I think Tariq Mansour has been playing every side simultaneously for 20 years and has survived through it by being very precise about what he chooses to share and with whom." He looked at her steadily. "I need to know what he's not sharing with me." Josephine turned her glass slowly. "What does the textile operation actually import?" The pause this time was different, longer considered the pause of a man deciding how much of a specific truth he wanted to extend. "Things that go through customs with textile codes," he said. She nodded. "And you want me to translate conversations between people who are at minimum engaged in customs fraud?" "At minimum," he agreed, and there was something almost wry in it. Not humor exactly, but the acknowledgement of someone who did not insult her intelligence by pretending the situation was other than it was. She looked at him across the table. "Mr. Rossi." "Taylor." She paused. "Taylor." The name felt strange in her mouth, too personal, too quickly, but he'd offered it, and she wasn't going to refuse it, because refusal had its own kind of message. "What happens if Tariq says something that changes the terms of your agreement? What do I do with that information?" "You tell me." "Immediately in the room. You'll have a signal." He reached into his jacket and set a small object on the table between them, a thin silver pen entirely unremarkable. "If you need to communicate something urgently, you use this. Click it twice. I'll create an interruption and we'll step out." She picked up the pen, turned it over, clicked it once experimentally, and looked at him. "Twice," he said. "I know." She set it back down. "What if what I hear suggests that someone in the room is planning to do something that isn't about negotiation?" The silence that followed was careful and total, and in it she felt the full weight of what she'd just asked, the specific perimeter she was drawing around her own role, the implicit message of it, which was, "I am not so committed to this agreement that I will translate my way past my own survival." "Then," he said slowly, "you click it twice immediately, and you don't wait for me to create the interruption. And then you trust me." She looked at him. He looked at her. In the background of the restaurant, someone laughed at something brief, ordinary, entirely separate from the conversation happening at this particular table. "I don't trust people I don't know," she said. "I'm aware." He did not seem offended by it. "Last night you said what you said to me without knowing if I was the kind of man who would stand up and have you removed from the restaurant and make sure you lost your job by morning." "Yes." "Why did you say it anyway?" She thought about it honestly. The way she tried to think about everything, without the comfortable softening that came from telling yourself a story that made your choices look better than they were. "Because not saying it would have cost me something I couldn't get back," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with a directness that had no performance in it at all, "Last night when I realized you understood what I'd said, I was ashamed. I want you to know that. Not embarrassed. Ashamed. There's a difference." She hadn't expected that. She was careful not to let how much she hadn't expected it show on her face. "There is a difference," she said. "I don't say things I don't mean," he said. "And I don't apologize for things unless the apology is accurate." He picked up his own water glass, held it without drinking. "What I said about you last night was inaccurate. It was the kind of thing a man says when he's irritated and careless and hasn't thought properly about the person in front of him." He set the glass down. "I was careless. I'm not usually." "What made you careless last night?" she asked. And she asked it not to push him, but because she genuinely wanted to know, because the question was real, and because she was already beginning to understand that Taylor Rossi responded to real questions differently than he responded to performed ones. He looked at her for a long moment. "I'd had a bad meeting," he said finally. "Bad enough that I brought it with me to dinner, which I don't do. And when the spill happened, I took my frustration and I put it somewhere it didn't belong." He paused. "On someone who didn't deserve it." "No," she said simply. "I didn't." "No," he agreed. "You didn't." They sat with that for a moment, not uncomfortably, but with the particular quality of a silence between two people who are both understanding something about the shape of what's happening between them and are not yet ready to name it. 6 o'clock tomorrow, he said. "I'll send a car." "I don't need a car. I'll take the subway." He looked at her. "I've been taking the subway my whole life," she said. "I'm not changing that now." That thing happened at the corner of his mouth again. The almost expression she was starting to learn was the version of a smile he was willing to let show in public. "The address will be texted to you at 5. "Fine." He stood. She stood. They were on the same side of the table, briefly closer than they'd been since the alcove, close enough that she was aware of the precise distance between them, with a specificity that was inconvenient. "Josephine," he said. "Yes." "You're going to be the most interesting person in the room tomorrow." He said it without flattery, the way you'd say a fact about weather or geography simply, and without embellishment. "I thought you should know that before you walk in." She looked at him for a moment. "I've been the most interesting person in a lot of rooms," she said. "Nobody ever noticed." "I noticed," he said. He left. She stood at the table long after the sound of his footsteps had gone, her fingers resting on the edge of the silver pen he'd left there, because he'd left it deliberately without drawing attention to leaving it, and she understood from that single detail more about how this man operated than she'd learned from anything that had been said. He expected her to keep it. He expected her to show up tomorrow. And the thing that was the most honest and the most troubling, the thing she sat with on the subway home while the city moved past the windows in its usual gorgeous, indifferent blur, was that she wanted to. Not because of the money, which was already handled, not because of Liam, who would be fine now, but because Taylor Rossi had looked at her, really looked at her the second kind of looking, but this time without the assessment and the filing and the categorization, and she had felt for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, like the full version of herself was the one who'd shown up, and she had no idea yet what to do with that. She slept better that night, which surprised her. Not well. She woke twice, once at 2 and once at 4:30, and both times she lay in the dark with the silver pen on the nightstand beside her, and the awareness of tomorrow sitting in her chest like something with weight and temperature. But between the waking, she actually slept, which was more than she'd expected from herself, and she took it as the kind of data point that was either reassuring or concerning, depending on how you looked at it. Either she had made peace with her decision, or she had simply stopped being afraid of things she should still be afraid of. She wasn't entirely sure which. She was dressed and out the door by 4:50. The address came through at 5:03 as promised, a building in the West 30s near the river, the kind of address that gave nothing away from its number alone. She took the A train and then walked the last 6 blocks because the morning air was cold and clean, and she wanted the walk. Wanted those 6 blocks to be hers before she gave the rest of the day to someone else's world. She was buzzed in at 5:58. The room she was taken to was on the 2nd floor, large conference style, already occupied when she arrived. Taylor was standing at the far end, speaking quietly with the broad-shouldered man from the restaurant, whose name she now knew from the briefing document Elaine had emailed her at 11 the previous night. Dominic Ferrara Taylor's operational second 14 years in the organization, trusted at a level that apparently very few people achieved. Dominic looked at Josephine when she entered with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was evaluating the look of a man who was still running his own calculation about whether she belonged in this room. She met his eyes directly and did not perform anything for him. He nodded slightly. She filed that away. 2 men she didn't recognize were seated at the conference table, reviewing something on a tablet. They didn't look up. Near the window, another man she didn't recognize, younger, dark-suited, was on a call, speaking too low to make out. Taylor crossed to her without urgency. "You're early," he said. "You said 5. "I said the address would come at 5. The meeting is 6. "I know what time the meeting is," she said. "I wanted to see the room first." Something shifted in his face, approval, clean and unperformed. "How do you want to be positioned?" The question surprised her, not because it was unexpected logistically, but because of how he asked it, the genuine deference of it, the implicit acknowledgement that she understood something about her own function that he didn't, and that he was willing to follow her lead on it. "Slightly behind you and to your right," she said. "Not at the table initially. I'll appear to be staff. Observers register staff as furniture. They'll speak more freely if I'm not seated as a peer." He looked at her for a moment. "That's good. I know." The Beirut group arrived at 612, 3 men, led by a compact gray-haired man named Samir Haddad, who moved with the particular energy of someone who had been important in rooms for so long that importance was simply his resting state. He shook Taylor's hand with the two-handed grip of a man performing warmth he'd calculated to the decimal point, and he greeted Dominic, and he looked at Josephine briefly, that same inventory look. The assessment, and his eyes moved on within a second and a half, which told her everything she needed to know about what he'd filed her under. Furniture, staff, background. Good. His two companions settled into chairs. Samir took the center position across from Taylor, with the ease of a man who always took center positions. The tablet came out. Coffee arrived. She had arranged the coffee, another deliberate choice, because people with coffee in front of them settle into a meeting in a way that makes them forget to be guarded at the precise level they need to be. Tariq Mansour arrived 7 minutes late. She had been told about Tariq. She had read the 3 paragraphs Elaine had included about him in the briefing document Facilitator, Egyptian National 20-year career, as a bridge between interests that would otherwise not sit at the same table. The document had described him as highly fluent in social navigation and known for misdirection through apparent transparency, which was an extraordinarily precise way of saying he was a man who told you things in order to control which things you noticed. He was smaller than she'd expected, and younger, perhaps 50, with reading glasses he wore on his face rather than on a chain, and the kind of groomed presentation that said, "money," without announcing it. He embraced Samir like an old friend, which he probably was. He shook Taylor's hand with a single clean grip, direct and brief. And then he looked at Josephine, and this look was different from Samir's look. He didn't move on in a second and a half. He held for 3 full seconds, his eyes doing something she recognized immediately as assessment of the more sophisticated variety, the kind that wasn't asking "who are you?" but "why are you here specifically?" She gave him nothing back. Polite, neutral, forgettable. He moved on. She exhaled. The meeting opened in English. Business courtesies, the careful initial language of men establishing that they were dealing with each other in good faith, which was its own kind of performance. Everyone in the room understood that good faith was a framework, not a fact, and that the framework existed to allow them to proceed toward their individual interests while maintaining the appearance of collective ones. Josephine stood slightly behind Taylor's right shoulder with a notepad she was not writing on. She listened. For the first 20 minutes, the English was sufficient general terms, distribution questions, the kind of logistics that could be discussed in any boardroom in the city. Samir asked about East Coast infrastructure. Taylor answered without answering, which she was beginning to understand was a core competency of his. He could speak for 5 minutes and give you the feeling of information, while the actual information remained exactly where it had started. Then Samir leaned toward one of his companions and said something in Arabic. Quiet, fast, the Arabic of men who have spoken together for years, who have developed the shorthand that comes from shared history and don't need to slow down for comprehension. He said the numbers he's giving us are from last quarter. His East Coast operation is smaller than he's representing. Check with Tariq. Josephine did not move. She wrote nothing on the notepad. She processed it, filed it, and continued listening. The companion responded barely audible. Tariq said the same thing last week. He thinks Rossi is positioning for leverage before the real discussion. Samir gave a small, barely perceptible nod and turned back to the table with a smile that was perfectly calibrated. Taylor, forgive me these figures for the Northeast Corridor. Are these projections or current operational numbers? Taylor said smoothly. Projections for Q2. We can look at current figures if that's more useful. Perhaps later, Samir said, and the smile stayed and didn't change, which was its own kind of information. Josephine watched Tariq. He was watching Taylor. His face was entirely composed, entirely pleasant, and she was already learning that his tells were not in his expression, but in his stillness. The quality of his attention when he was doing the most calculation was paradoxically a kind of extra quiet that looked like ease. He was very quiet right now. At the 40-minute mark, Taylor called a brief break. Coffee phones, the natural pause that gave bodies a rest, and minds a chance to recalibrate. He moved to refill his cup, and Josephine moved to stand near the service table, close enough that they could speak at low volume without appearing to be conferring. "Samir knows your numbers are understated," she murmured, keeping her eyes on the coffee service. His man confirmed it with Tariq last week. They're positioning to force a real disclosure in the second session. Taylor didn't react, not visibly. He poured his coffee with the same unhurried motion. Tariq briefed them. "Yes, a beat. Is that all? So far?" She picked up a cup, set it down. "Tariq is running something I can't fully see yet. He's listening to everything too carefully for a man whose role is facilitation. He's looking for a specific moment." "To do what?" "I don't know yet." He looked at her sideways briefly. "Tell me when you do." "That's what the pen is for," she said. He almost smiled. He took his coffee back to the table. The second session was different. The temperature in the room shifted, subtle but real, the way the air in a room changes when everyone stops performing the opening act and starts playing for something. Samir's questions got more specific. Taylor's answers got more precise, which meant he'd decided to give up controlled ground in order to protect whatever ground he actually cared about. Dominic, seated at the far end, had gone very still in the way of someone whose job was to watch the room and who had found something worth watching. And Tariq spoke for the first time in Arabic to Samir, leaning close, his voice at the precise volume of a man who believed he was inaudible to everyone except his intended recipient. He said, "Push on the warehouse question. Get him to confirm the Raritan location." Josephine's hand tightened around the pen. The Raritan location. She didn't know what that was. She didn't need to know what it was to understand that someone with Tariq's function wanting it confirmed in a meeting meant it was information being collected, not exchanged. Collected by someone whose interests were not necessarily aligned with anyone else at this table. She turned the pen in her fingers, clicked it twice. Taylor stopped mid-sentence. "Excuse me," he said to the table with the ease of a man who had not just heard a signal. "I need a moment with my team on a logistics point." He stood, looked at Dominic. 5 minutes. The room accepted this without resistance. Samir nodded. Tariq said nothing, but his stillness changed quality, and she felt him register her register. Her movement, the way she followed Taylor out, the fact of her presence in this, in a way that exceeded what he'd originally categorized her as. She felt it on the back of her neck as she walked out of the room. In the corridor, Taylor turned to her immediately. No preamble. "Tariq?" "He told Samir to push you on confirming a warehouse location. He said Raritan. He said confirm it, not discuss it, confirm specifically." Taylor's expression didn't break, but something in his jaw changed. A tiny, controlled adjustment. "He's collecting verification." "For who?" His eyes moved to Dominic, who had followed them out and whose face up close was doing something significantly less calm than his posture suggested. "Who else knows about Raritan?" he said to Dominic, low and direct. Dominic said, 3 people, me, Chen, and Tariq. Silence. She watched Taylor process this, and she watched it happen fast. The calculation, the implications, the assembly of something he'd apparently already suspected into something that was now confirmed, and she understood from watching it happen that this was not a surprise to him, not fully. It was more like a test result arriving to tell you the thing you already feared was actually there. "He's the source," Taylor said, not a question. "Has been for a while, looks like," Dominic said. "How long?" "Long enough that this meeting wasn't about distribution at all." Josephine stood very still. "What was it about?" Both men looked at her. "It was about getting me to confirm operational details that don't appear in any document," Taylor said. Because someone wants those details and can't get them any other way. He paused. Tariq brokered this meeting. He chose the format, the participants, the timing. He set it up, she said. He set it up. She thought about the warehouse, about Tariq's very specific stillness, about the way he had looked at her when he arrived. 3 full seconds, the more sophisticated assessment, the question that wasn't, "Who are you?" but "Why are you here specifically?" "He knows I hurt him," she said. Both men looked at her again. "When I clicked the pen," she said, "he was watching the room. He registered that I moved, that I communicated something that we left immediately after he spoke." She kept her voice even. "He's going to know if he doesn't already that I'm not furniture." The silence in the corridor had a new quality. Dominic said very quietly to Taylor, "We should wrap this meeting, today." "Yes," Taylor said, and Tariq, "Not here." Taylor looked at Josephine. "Are you okay?" The question was direct and undecorated, and genuinely meant she could hear the genuineness of it, which was different from the performed version that people usually offered in crisis-adjacent moments, and the difference made her chest do something inconvenient. "I'm fine," she said. "You're sure?" "I said I'm fine. What do you need from me for the next 10 minutes? He looked at her for one beat. "Translate anything Tariq says to Samir. Exactly. Don't interpret. Don't edit." "Understood." They went back in. The next 11 minutes were the most precise exercise in controlled performance she had ever witnessed. Taylor brought the meeting to a close with the practiced ease of a man who had been ending conversations at exactly the right moment his entire professional life, gracious, warm at the surface, entirely definitive underneath. He cited a scheduling conflict. He proposed a follow-up within the week. He shook Samir's hand with both of his and said something that made Samir laugh, and the laugh was real and none of it was. Tariq, during all of this, said 2 things to Samir in Arabic. The first, "He's cutting it short. Something happened." The second, quieter, as they were standing to leave the woman. "Find out who she is." Josephine wrote neither of these things on her notepad. She held them in the place she held everything that couldn't be dealt with right this minute, the place that was getting very full very quickly. And she stood at the service table with the silver pen in her jacket pocket and watched Tariq Mansour walk out of the room. He paused at the door. He turned and looked at her. Direct. Not the 3-second assessment from the beginning. Something else, a look of a man who had made a new entry in a list she very much did not want to be on. Then he was gone. Dominic had his phone out before the elevator closed. Taylor was at the window, his back to the room, and she could see from the line of his shoulders that he was doing the thing she recognized from herself, the controlled internal recalibration, the quiet reorganization of a situation that had gone differently than planned. She crossed to stand beside him. Not close, just near. "The second thing Tariq said," she told him. As they were leaving, "He told Samir to find out who I am." Taylor turned from the window. His eyes were different now, not harder exactly, but more focused, the difference between a man at rest and a man who has shifted fully into operational mode. "You're going to need to know that," he said about Tariq's words, and then immediately after with a weight that was different from the rest, "And I need to make sure that doesn't matter." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means you're not just a consultant anymore," Dominic said from across the room, not looking up from his phone. "Whether you want to be or not." She looked at Dominic. She looked at Taylor. "I signed a 3-day agreement," she said. "I know," Taylor said. "Today is day 1. "I know," he said again, and the way he said it the second time was different from the first, quieter with something in it that sat between an apology and a promise, and was too honest to be either of those things cleanly. She looked at the empty room, the chairs still holding the shape of the people who'd sat in them, the coffee cups, the surface of a table across which a meeting had happened that was not the meeting anyone was supposed to know about. She thought about Tariq's eyes at the door. She thought about find out who she is. She reached into her jacket pocket, and she turned the silver pen over in her fingers once slowly, and then she put it back. "What happens tomorrow?" she said. Taylor answered her question about tomorrow with a single word. Raritan. She didn't ask him to elaborate. She could hear from the way he said it. Flat final, the word carrying its own weight, that elaborating wasn't the point. The point was that the thing Tariq had been trying to extract from the meeting was now the thing that needed to be dealt with directly, and directly meant the warehouse, and the warehouse meant leaving the controlled terrain of conference rooms and coffee service and silver pens with signals built into them. Dominic drove her home that evening without being asked to. Taylor had said it quietly to him, "Take her home," in a tone that wasn't an order, but wasn't a suggestion either. And Dominic had nodded, and she had started to object, and then looked at the expression on Taylor's face and made the decision that some arguments weren't worth the energy they cost. In the car, Dominic didn't make conversation. She appreciated that. She sat in the back seat and watched Manhattan move past the windows and thought about Tariq's eyes at the door and the specific quality of "find out who she is" and what it meant that a man like that now knew she existed. "How long have you worked for him?" she asked. Dominic glanced in the rearview mirror. 14 years. "Do you trust him?" A pause. The kind that meant the answer was yes, but the person wanted you to understand the yes was not simple. "With my life," he said finally. "Have, multiple times." "Has he ever been wrong about a person?" Another pause, shorter. "Twice that I know of. Both times he figured it out before it mattered." He looked at the road. "He figured out Tariq 6 months ago. He just needed confirmation he couldn't manufacture himself." She absorbed this. "He brought me into a situation he already knew was compromised." He brought you into a situation where your specific ability was the only thing that could give him clean confirmation. Dominic's voice was neutral, factual. "There's a difference." "There's also a similarity," she said. He didn't argue with that. He pulled up to her building at 7:43, and she got out, and he said without preamble, "Be ready at 7 tomorrow. I'll be here." "I'll take the subway," she said. "Ms. Miller." He looked at her through the open window with an expression that was as close to gentle as she suspected his face got when he was on duty. "Tariq's people work fast. Take the car." She looked at him for a moment. 7, she said. She went upstairs. She called Liam because she needed to hear a voice that was fully hers, that belonged to the life she'd been living before Friday night. Before a plain white card and a silver pen and a facilitator who now knew her name didn't appear in any official capacity in that room. He picked up on the second ring. "Joe, hey, I paid Caruso." "Good. All of it." He seemed almost disappointed. "I think he wanted the excuse to anyway. It's done." A pause. "You okay? You sound different." "I'm fine. Joe." "I'm working on something," she said. "It's almost done. The translation thing." "Yes." "Is it—" He stopped. Started again. "Is it safe?" She thought about Tariq's eyes, about Raritan, about tomorrow morning 7 a.m., Dominic's car outside her building. "It will be," she said. "Go to sleep, Liam." "Okay." He paused. "Joe, whatever you're doing, thank you. I know I don't say that right. I never say it right, but I know," she said. "I know you do." She hung up and sat in the quiet of her apartment with the silver pen on the kitchen table in front of her and the full shape of tomorrow assembling itself in her mind piece by piece, the way complex things always assembled themselves for her, not all at once, but in a sequence, each element finding its place relative to the others, until the picture was complete enough to act on. She slept 4 hours, clean, dreamless. The sleep of someone who has finished deciding. Dominic was outside at 6:58. She got in the car without comment, and they drove in the same efficient silence as the night before, which she was starting to understand was simply how Dominic moved through the world economically, without decoration, conserving everything for the moments that actually required expenditure. The Raritan location was 40 minutes from the city. A warehouse district near the river, the kind of area that existed in every major metropolitan region, the industrial margin where the city's official life stopped and something less official began. She had been in places like this before growing up in Dubai, following her father through the outer edges of the port districts where his oil contracts required occasional site visits. Learning early that the real business of the world happened in the unglamorous spaces between the visible ones. Taylor was already there when they arrived. He was standing outside with 2 men she hadn't seen before. younger alert the particular quality of stillness that she was beginning to recognize as the specific training of people whose job was to keep other people alive. He looked at her when she got out of the car, and something moved through his expression that she couldn't fully name relief, maybe at the edges, though she wasn't sure Taylor Rossi allowed himself relief as a first response to anything. "Good morning," she said. "You slept," he said. 4 hours. That's more than me." She looked at him. The lines around his eyes were slightly more pronounced than yesterday, not from age, but from the specific tiredness of a man who had been running calculations through the night that didn't have clean solutions. She had the impulse, brief and inconvenient, to say something that wasn't professional, and she set it aside. "What are we doing here?" she asked. "The Beirut group is coming here this afternoon," he said. "Samir requested a site visit after the meeting yesterday, part of the original plan for the engagement. We couldn't cancel it without signaling that something changed. Tariq will be with them." "Yes, and you're going to let that happen." "I'm going to let Tariq believe the situation is still as he designed it," Taylor said. "Because if he believes that he won't move his timeline, and if he doesn't move his timeline, I control when this ends." She understood the logic. She also understood what it required. "You need me in the room again. I need you to hear everything he says, and when, not just what. The sequence matters. The sequence is everything." He looked at her steadily. "Tariq communicates confirmation to whoever he's working for at a specific point in the meeting. I need to know exactly when he does it, because the moment he sends that signal is the moment his protection ends." She turned this over. "His protection from whom? From the people who will be very unhappy to learn he's been feeding operational information to a competing interest for the better part of 6 months. Samir's group, and others." He paused. "Tariq has been managing 3 separate relationships simultaneously, telling each one things that benefit him at the expense of the others. It's a sustainable arrangement as long as none of the 3 compare notes." Another pause. "We're comparing notes today." The full architecture of it settled over her, then the patience of it, the precision. The fact that this afternoon was not a confrontation, but a closing, and that she was the instrument through which the closing would happen. "If this goes wrong," she said, "it won't. Taylor." She said his name the way she'd learned to say it, direct no performance, the version that required him to be direct back. "If it goes wrong." He looked at her for a long moment. "Then we leave. Immediately together through the east exit. Dom will have the car on that side." He held her eyes. "I won't let anything happen to you." "I'm not asking for protection," she said. "I'm asking for the honest exit strategy." "That is the honest exit strategy." She nodded. "Okay." They went inside. The warehouse was operational. She could tell from the sounds and the controlled movement of people doing actual work, the particular rhythm of a functioning logistical space. Taylor had arranged the meeting in an upper office that overlooked the main floor, a room that was clearly used for exactly this kind of discussion, fitted with a table and chairs and the same kind of unremarkable professional setup she was becoming familiar with. Samir arrived at 2. Tariq arrived with him. And the third person who arrived with them was someone she hadn't been briefed on, a woman perhaps 60 small and compact, with the posture of someone who had spent decades being underestimated and had decided decades ago to stop being surprised by it. She was introduced as a silent observer. Her name was given as Layla. She shook Taylor's hand and Dominic's hand and looked at Josephine with the same 3-second assessment Tariq had used the day before. And Josephine felt it land differently this time, not as a threat, but as a recognition. One woman reading another in the specific register that had nothing to do with the men in the room. She filed that away. The meeting opened with a site review, logistics capacity, the practical questions of an operation, considering whether this location suited their needs. Taylor answered everything directly, which was its own signal, the performance of a man who has decided to give ground on purpose. Samir was visibly more comfortable today than yesterday. The site visit validated something for him, and his comfort made him less careful, and his reduced carefulness made him more talkative. Tariq was quiet. She watched him the way she'd taught herself to watch people in rooms, not with direct attention, which people felt even when they weren't looking at you, but with the peripheral awareness she'd developed growing up, moving between languages, between cultures, between the visible and the invisible registers of human communication. She watched him the way she'd watched the Arabic neighborhoods of Dubai from her bedroom window, taking it all in without appearing to focus on any of it. He had his phone on the table, face up. She clocked the angle of it. She clocked the way his thumb moved to it at regular intervals without lifting it, the small, nearly invisible motion of a man composing something he needed to send at precisely the right moment. Samir said something to him in Arabic, casual, about the capacity numbers Taylor had just provided. Tariq responded, "More than enough. Tell him you want the exclusivity clause in writing before we proceed." Samir nodded almost imperceptibly. The phone stayed face up. Josephine's hand found the pen in her jacket pocket. She held it without clicking it. Not yet. Samir said to Taylor, "The numbers are strong. We'd want exclusivity in the Northeast Corridor formalized before we move to next steps." Taylor said, "That's a reasonable ask. Dominic can have language drafted by end of week." Samir smiled. Tariq smiled. The phone face up on the table. And then the woman Layla, who had not said a word since she entered, spoke, in Arabic, to Tariq, at a volume and speed that was clearly intended to be below the threshold of anyone at the table following it. She said, "You told them about the Raritan numbers last month. Before this meeting, they already knew going in." Josephine went very still. Tariq's face did not change. His response was immediate and smooth. "I prepared the ground." "That's the job." "Layla, Samir doesn't know you prepared the ground. He thinks his information came from his own channels. Tariq, Samir doesn't need to know everything." Layla quieter with an edge that cut through the smoothness like something that had been waiting Tariq. "I came here today because the people I represent wanted me to look you in the eye and know whether the Rossi engagement was clean." A pause. "It isn't, is it?" The table continued around them. Taylor and Samir and Dominic and the logistics, the exclusivity clause, the ordinary business of the meeting's surface. None of them heard what was happening underneath it, because none of them spoke Arabic at the level required. Tariq said very quietly, "Layla, don't." Her voice was entirely calm. "I've been doing this longer than you. I know what triple positioning looks like. I know what you've built here." Another pause. "And I know that the woman standing behind Rossi has understood every word of this conversation." Josephine clicked the pen. Twice. Fast. Taylor stood up. "I need to take this call," he said, already moving, already creating the interruption with the practiced ease of a man who had been waiting for that signal and had his exit built before the need for it arrived. "Dom, can you take them through the eastern section while I step out 10 minutes? Dominic was already moving. The room redistributed. She followed Taylor out and the door closed behind them, and she had 4 seconds before he turned to her, and she said fast and precise, "Layla isn't with Samir. She's a third party. She came to verify whether Tariq had compromised the engagement, and she determined that he had. She also made me. She told Tariq I understood the conversation." Taylor said, "Layla Nassif." She stopped. "You know her. She represents the Cairo interest, not Tariq. She's the actual principal." His jaw had that adjustment again, the small, controlled tightening. "Tariq told me she was an observer. He didn't tell me whose observer." "She's not going to let this meeting conclude without addressing what she knows," Josephine said. "No." "Which means Tariq's position collapses in the next 20 minutes, whether you move on it or not." "Yes." "So what do you do?" He looked at her. Something in his expression was different from anything she'd seen across the 4 days she'd known him, not harder, but more open somehow, the specific openness of a man who was at the edge of what he'd planned and was deciding whether to trust the ground beyond it. "I tell the truth," he said. She blinked. "To the room. To Layla." He straightened. "Samir's going to be collateral damage of Tariq's choices. That's not my problem to manage. But Layla came here to make a determination about whether this engagement is trustworthy. If I get ahead of what she already knows, I have a chance at her. If I wait for her to surface it, I lose her before I start. That's a significant risk." "So was hiring a waitress," he said. She looked at him for one beat. "Go," she said. He went back in. She followed. What happened next took 11 minutes, and she watched every second of it with the particular attention of someone who understood that she was witnessing a thing that most people in the world never saw: a genuinely powerful man choosing transparency, not as a strategy, but as a bet, placing the full weight of his credibility on the belief that honesty delivered precisely and at the exact right moment was more durable than any construction built on managed information. He looked at Layla directly and said in English, "Ms. Nassif, I know who you represent and I know why you're here. I also know that Tariq has been managing information flows between 3 separate interests, including yours, in ways that none of those interests authorized." He paused. "I'm telling you this because you've already established it independently, and because I would rather you hear it from me than wonder why I waited." The room went completely silent. Samir looked at Tariq. Tariq's composure held for approximately 4 seconds. Then something in it fractured, not dramatically, not loudly, but with the particular quality of a thing that has been under sustained pressure finally reaching the precise stress point it cannot hold past. He said, "Taylor, don't." Taylor said, and the word was quiet and final and took all the air out of whatever Tariq had been building toward. Layla looked at Taylor for a long moment. Then she looked at Josephine. "Your interpreter understood our conversation," she said. "Yes," Taylor said. "You placed her in the room knowing she would." "Yes." "And she told you what she heard." "That's what I hired her for," Taylor said. Layla was quiet for a moment. Then, to Josephine's complete surprise, she said in Arabic, looking directly at Josephine, "You're very good at being invisible." Josephine responded in Arabic, meeting her eyes, "I've had a lot of practice." Something moved across Layla's face, not quite a smile, but the internal structure of one. She turned back to Taylor and said in English, "My clients will want a direct conversation, without facilitation." "Agreed," Taylor said. "And the facilitation arrangement?" She glanced at Tariq with an expression that was entirely without heat, which was somehow more final than anger, "ends here." Tariq stood up. He looked at the table at the room at Josephine last of all, and his look this time was not the sophisticated assessment of the doorway or the warning at the door. It was the look of a man who had built something very careful and watched it come apart at a single point he had failed to account for. He picked up his phone from the table. He left. No one stopped him. No one needed to. The meeting concluded 30 minutes later with a handshake between Taylor and Layla that was brief and direct, and worth Josephine understood from the conversation around it considerably more than anything that had been discussed in the previous 2 days. Samir was gracious in the adjustment, which told her he was smarter than his comfort earlier had suggested he'd recognized. The landscape had changed and recalibrated without drama, which was its own kind of skill. When it was over and the room had emptied, Taylor stood at the window and Josephine stood with him, and neither of them spoke for a moment, because the moment didn't require speech yet. Then he said, "Liam's debt is cleared." She turned to look at him. "As of this morning," he said. "Not from your payment? Separately." "Taylor." "It was already done," he said. "Before today, before the meeting." He looked at her. "It wasn't leverage. I want you to know that. It was never leverage." She looked at him for a long time, long enough to read the thing beneath the words, the thing that was harder for him to say than any operational truth he'd delivered in the past hour. "Then what was it?" she said. "It was the one thing I could do," he said simply, "for someone who had already done something for me that I couldn't have asked for and wouldn't have known how to." She thought about this restaurant, the spill, the Arabic words she'd launched into the air without knowing what they'd set in motion, the rules she'd kept for 34 years and broken in a single breath. She thought about what Layla had said, "You're very good at being invisible," and what she'd said back. "I've had a lot of practice." Past tense, already past tense even when she'd said it. She reached into her jacket pocket. She took out the silver pen. She held it out to him. He looked at it, then at her. "Keep it," he said. "I don't work for you anymore," she said. 3 days. The agreement said 3 days. "The agreement is done," he agreed. "That's not what I mean." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" He took the pen from her hand, not taking it back, but closing her fingers back around it, his hand over hers for exactly the length of a breath. "I mean that whatever comes next," he said, "I'd rather you had a way to reach me." She looked down at her hand, at his hand briefly over hers, at the pen that was, she understood now, not a signal device at all. It had never been. Only a signal device. She put it back in her pocket. "I want something," she said. "Name it. I want you to understand that I am not going to become invisible again," she said. "Not for you, not for your world, not for any room I walk into. Whatever this is, whatever comes next, I walk in as myself, fully, or I don't walk in." He looked at her with that expression she'd first seen at the restaurant table. The one she now understood was what attention looked like on a man who gave it to almost no one. "That's the only version of you I've ever met," he said. "It's the only one I want." She stood very still. Then she did the thing she had not planned to do, and had not given herself permission to consider, and had been aware of in the peripheral way she was aware of most true things, not as an impulse, but as a fact she'd been moving toward without looking at directly. She kissed him, brief, precise, the same way she did everything that mattered, without performance, without apology, with the full weight of a woman who had decided. He was very still for exactly 1 second. Then he wasn't. When she stepped back, he looked at her with something she had never expected to see on the face of Taylor Rossi, something uncalculated and unguarded, and entirely, completely real. She picked up her bag. "I'm going to need to call Marcus," she said. "I've missed 2 shifts. He blinked, a breath of almost laughter. "I'll handle Marcus." "You absolutely will not handle Marcus," she said. "I'll handle Marcus. You've done enough handling for 1 week. He looked at her. That thing at the corner of his mouth, except this time it became the full version, unguarded, unreserved, the smile she hadn't been sure he was capable of until this exact moment. She walked to the door. "Josephine." She turned. "You were the most interesting person in every room," he said. "Every single one." She looked at him across the space between them, the warehouse office, the afternoon light, the full 4 days that had delivered her here from the alcove of a restaurant 40 floors above a city that had never quite made room for her. "I know," she said, and she meant it. For the first time in longer than she could measure, she meant it without qualification, without the asterisk of someone else's opinion or the background noise of a voice that had been running since childhood. She walked out. Not away from something, toward it. The woman who had spent 34 years perfecting the art of invisibility had finally precisely and without any further intention of reversal chosen to be seen, and the world as it turned out was not as unprepared for her as it had always insisted.